The Arizona sun blazed mercilessly overhead as 8-year-old Samuel Morrison urged his pinto pony deeper into the maze of saguaro cacti and red sandstone formations. The boy's blue eyes sparkled with the kind of reckless adventure that only comes with youth and inexperience. His father had warned him countless times about venturing too far from the ranch, but the call of exploration proved stronger than William Morrison's stern lectures. "Come on, Patches," Samuel whispered to his horse, patting the animal's spotted neck. "Just a little further. I want to see what's beyond that ridge." The Morrison Ranch sprawled across thousands of acres of prime Arizona territory land, its boundaries marked by natural landmarks that Samuel had memorized from countless rides with the ranch hands. But today, caught up in chasing a roadrunner that had darted between the cacti, he had lost track of those familiar markers. As the afternoon wore on, the landscape began to look increasingly foreign. The friendly cottonwoods that lined the creek near home were nowhere to be seen. Instead, jagged rock formations jutted skyward like ancient sentinels, casting long shadows that seemed to point in every direction except toward safety. Samuel's confidence began to waver as Patches grew skittish, her ears flicking nervously at sounds the boy couldn't identify. The desert, which had seemed so inviting in the morning light, now felt vast and hostile. Every rustle in the brush could be a rattlesnake. Every shadow might hide a mountain lion. "Easy, girl," Samuel murmured, though his own voice trembled slightly. "We'll find our way home soon." But as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Samuel had to face the terrible truth. He was completely lost. The landmarks he thought he recognized led only to more unfamiliar terrain, and Patches was beginning to limp, favoring her left foreleg. Panic crept into the boy's chest like ice water. His father's warnings echoed in his mind. Warnings about the dangers that lurked in the desert, about the Apache who still roamed these lands, despite the government's attempts to contain them on reservations. Samuel had always dismissed these concerns as adult worry, but now, alone and vulnerable, every shadow seemed to conceal a threat. As darkness approached, Samuel dismounted to examine Patch's injured leg. The pony had stepped wrong on the rocky ground, and her hoof was tender to the touch. Walking would be slow and painful for her, but riding might cause permanent damage. "I'm sorry, girl," Samuel whispered, tears mixing with the dust on his cheeks. "This is all my fault." The desert night descended with surprising swiftness, bringing with it a bone-deep cold that seemed impossible after the day's scorching heat. Samuel had no blanket, no food, and only the water in his small canteen. He led Patches to a sheltered spot between two large boulders and settled down to wait for dawn, hoping that somehow someone would find them. But the vast Arizona wilderness stretched endlessly in all directions, and Samuel Morrison was just one small boy in an ocean of stone and sage, his cries for help swallowed by the wind that whispered through the ancient canyons. Ayana moved through the desert like a shadow-given form, his moccasined feet finding purchase on loose stone without disturbing so much as a pebble. At 25, he possessed the lean, muscular build of a warrior who had learned to survive in the harshest of landscapes. His long black hair was bound with a strip of leather, and his weathered buckskin clothing bore the practical simplicity of his Apache heritage. He had been tracking a small band of wild horses for 2 days, hoping to add to his modest herd. The animals had led him far from his hidden camp in the Dragoon Mountains into territory that bordered the white man's settlements. It was dangerous ground for an Apache to travel, but Ayana had learned to move unseen, to read the land's moods and avoid the soldiers who still patrolled these regions. The morning sun was climbing steadily when Ayana detected something that made him pause. The wind carried a scent that didn't belong, the smell of a horse but different from the wild mustangs he'd been following. This was a domestic animal, well-fed and cared for. And beneath that, something else, the salt-sweet smell of human fear and exhaustion. Following his instincts, Ayana altered his course toward a cluster of red boulders that rose from the desert floor like sleeping giants. As he approached, he could hear it clearly now, the soft whimpering of a child punctuated by the gentle nickering of a horse in distress. Moving with infinite care, Ayana climbed the rocks until he could peer down into the sheltered space between the boulders. What he saw there stopped him cold. A young white boy, no more than 8 or 9 years old, sat curled against a spotted pony. Both child and animal showed clear signs of distress. The boy's lips were cracked from dehydration, his face streaked with tears and dust. while the horse held one foreleg gingerly off the ground. Ayana's jaw tightened. He knew he should turn and walk away. The boy was clearly from one of the nearby ranches, probably the Morrison spread that lay to the east. Getting involved with white settlers, especially their children, was asking for trouble. If he were discovered, he'd be lucky to make it back to the reservation alive. But as he watched, the boy tried to stand and immediately swayed, his small legs barely able to support him. The child was dying of thirst and exposure, and the injured horse wouldn't be carrying him anywhere. Without help, both would be dead before another day passed. Ayana closed his eyes and felt the weight of a decision that could change everything. In his mind, he could hear his grandfather's voice, speaking words from his childhood. A warrior's strength is not measured by whom he can defeat, but by whom he chooses to protect. When Ayana opened his eyes, his path was clear. Moving slowly so as not to startle the boy, Ayana descended from the rocks. Samuel looked up at the approaching figure with eyes wide with terror, his small body trembling as he pressed closer to his injured pony. "Please," Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible, "please don't hurt us." Ayana stopped several feet away and slowly raised his hands, palms forward, in the universal gesture of peace. When he spoke, his English was careful but clear, learned during his brief time at the government school before he'd escaped back to his people. "I mean no harm, young one," Ayana said quietly. "You are hurt. Your horse is hurt. You need help." Samuel stared at the Apache warrior, his mind struggling to process what was happening. All his life, he'd been told that the Apache were savage enemies, dangerous and unpredictable. But this man's voice was gentle, his manner calm and reassuring. "Are you going to kill me?" Samuel asked, the question torn from him by exhaustion and fear. Ayana's expression softened. "No, little brother. I'm going to help you live." Ayana knelt beside the exhausted boy, moving with deliberate slowness to avoid triggering panic. From his leather pouch, he withdrew a water gourd carved from a desert plant, its surface smooth from years of use. Samuel's eyes fixed on it with desperate hunger. "Drink slowly," Ayana instructed, supporting the boy's head as he tilted the gourd to his cracked lips. "Too much, too fast will make you sick." Samuel nodded weakly, forcing himself to take small sips despite every instinct screaming at him to drain the container. The water was warm but clean, tasting faintly of the herbs Ayana used to purify it. As the liquid touched his parched throat, Samuel felt life flowing back into his small body. "What is your name?" Ayana asked while the boy drank. "Samuel," came the whispered reply. "Samuel Morrison." Ayana's expression didn't change, but internally he felt a chill of recognition. The Morrison name was well known throughout the territory. William Morrison was one of the largest landowners in Arizona, a man whose cattle operation employed dozens of workers and whose influence reached all the way to the territorial capital. He was also known for his vocal opposition to any Apache presence outside the reservations. "My father, he'll be looking for me," Samuel continued, his voice gaining slight strength from the water. "He has many men. They'll come." "Yes," Ayana agreed quietly. "But first we must keep you alive until they find you." The Apache warrior turned his attention to Patches, running gentle hands along the pony's injured leg. The horse shied initially, but Ayana's touch was sure and calming. He'd learned horse medicine from his grandfather, knowledge that proved invaluable in a life where horses often meant the difference between survival and death. "She has strained the tendons," Ayana explained to Samuel. "Not broken, but she cannot carry you. We must make her comfortable." From his pack, Ayana produced strips of soft leather and what appeared to be a poultice made from desert plants. As he worked to bind the horse's leg, he explained each step to Samuel, partly to distract the boy from their desperate situation, and partly because he sensed the child's genuine love for the animal. "This is from the prickly pear," Ayana said, showing Samuel the green paste he was applying. "It reduces the swelling and pain. My people have used it for many generations." Samuel watched in fascination as the Apache's skilled hands worked. "How do you know so much about healing?" "My grandfather taught me," Ayana replied, securing the bandage with practiced efficiency. "He said that a warrior who cannot heal cannot truly protect." As the morning progressed, Ayana constructed a simple shelter using his blanket and some dried ocotillo branches, creating shade for both boy and horse. He shared his meager rations, dried meat, pine nuts, and a sweet cake made from desert fruit, and told Samuel stories of the desert to keep his spirits up. You see that mountain? Ayana pointed to a distant peak. My people call it place where the eagle rests. Long ago, a great eagle lived there who could see all the way to the setting sun. When hunters were lost, they would climb high and look for the eagle's flight to find their way home. Samuel listened with rapt attention, his fear gradually being replaced by curiosity. This Apache warrior wasn't the savage monster his father had described. Ayana was gentle, knowledgeable, and clearly going out of his way to help someone who, by all rights, should be his enemy. "Why are you helping me?" Samuel asked as the afternoon heat began to build. Ayana was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes scanning the horizon. "Because you needed help," he said finally. "And because my grandfather taught me that the measure of a man is not in the color of his skin or the language he speaks, but in what he does when he finds someone in need." As the day wore on, Ayana began to worry. He had hoped that Morrison's search parties would have appeared by now, but the desert remained empty, except for the buzzards that circled hopefully overhead. Samuel was in better condition thanks to water and rest, but they couldn't stay here indefinitely. The boy needed proper food and shelter, and Patches needed veterinary care that Ayana couldn't provide. By late afternoon, Ayana had made his decision. "Samuel," he said quietly, "we cannot wait here anymore. I must take you closer to your home, where your father's men can find you." Samuel looked up at him with trust that made Ayana's chest tight. "Will you stay with me?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that both understood, despite the difference in their ages. If Ayana were caught with the Morrison boy, he would likely be shot on sight. But looking into Samuel's eyes, he found he couldn't bring himself to abandon the child now. "I will stay until you are safe," Ayana promised, and meant it with every fiber of his being. William Morrison stood on the wide veranda of his ranch house, his weathered hands gripping the wooden railing as he stared out at the vast expanse of desert that had swallowed his son. 48 hours had passed since Samuel had failed to return from his afternoon ride, and every minute that ticked by felt like a year torn from William's life. "Still no sign of him, boss," reported Jake Fletcher, Morrison's foreman, as he dismounted from his lathered horse. The man's face was grim with exhaustion and worry. "We've covered every canyon and wash within 10 miles of the ranch. Found some tracks near Willow Creek, but they disappeared in the rocks." William nodded curtly, though his heart was breaking. At 52, he was a man accustomed to controlling his world through sheer force of will and determination. He had built his cattle empire from nothing, fought off rustlers and drought, and had always found a way to protect what was his. But the desert was an enemy he couldn't intimidate or outmaneuver. "Double the search parties," William ordered, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "Send word to Fort Huachuca. I want every available soldier out there, and put up the reward posters in Tombstone and Tucson. $5,000 for my boy's safe return." Eleanor Morrison emerged from the house, her normally perfect appearance disheveled from 2 sleepless nights. At 38, she remained a beautiful woman, but worry had carved deep lines around her blue eyes, eyes the same shade as her missing son's. "William," she said quietly, placing a gentle hand on his arm, "you need to eat something. You haven't touched food since yesterday." "I can't," William replied, not taking his gaze from the horizon. "Not while Samuel is out there." Eleanor understood. She felt the same gnawing emptiness, the same desperate need to do something, anything that might bring their boy home. But she also recognized the signs of a man pushing himself beyond his limits. "He's strong, William," she said softly. "He's your son. He won't give up." "He's 8 years old, Eleanor." William's voice cracked slightly. "He's just a little boy who wanted to explore." What kind of father lets his child ride off into that wilderness alone? Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A rider was coming hard from the east, dust streaming behind his horse like a banner. William's heart leaped with hope until he recognized the man, Tom Bradley, one of his most experienced hands. "Mr. Morrison," Bradley called as he reined in his exhausted mount. "We found something." William was down the steps and beside the horse before the man could dismount. "Samuel? Did you find Samuel?" "Not the boy, sir," Bradley said, his expression troubled. "But we found tracks, fresh ones, maybe 6 hours old, leading away from Devil's Canyon toward the Dragoons." "What kind of tracks?" William demanded. Bradley hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what he had to report. "Horse tracks, sir. Unshod pony, moving slow, being led by someone on foot." "And Mr. Morrison?" "The footprints aren't from any boot. They're moccasin tracks, Apache. The words hit William like a physical blow. His worst fears were being realized. His son had fallen into the hands of the very people he'd spent years fighting to keep off his land. Every story he'd heard about Apache raids, every tale of captives taken into the mountains, flooded through his mind. "How many?" William asked, his voice deadly calm. "Just one, from what we could tell." "But sir, there's something else. The horse tracks, they match the description of Samuel's pony. The gait suggests the animal is injured, being led instead of ridden." William's jaw clenched. If the Apache had Samuel, if they were taking him into the mountains, he'd heard the stories of white children raised as Apache, their own families becoming foreign to them. The thought of losing his son not just to death, but to a life where Samuel might forget he'd ever been a Morrison, was almost unbearable. "Get the men ready," William ordered, his voice taking on the hard edge that his employees knew meant business. "Full gear, weapons and provisions for a week. We're going into the dragoons." "William, wait." Eleanor stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "If they have Samuel and you ride in with guns blazing, what do you think will happen to him?" "I'm not leaving my son with those savages," William replied, but Eleanor could hear the uncertainty beneath his fierce words. "And I'm not asking you to," she said firmly. "But think, William, if one Apache wanted to harm Samuel, why would he bother treating an injured horse? Why lead it gently instead of abandoning it? Maybe whoever has our son is trying to help him." William stared at his wife, her words warring with everything he'd believed about the Apache, but deep in his heart, a small voice whispered that she might be right. It was a voice he'd been trying to silence for 2 days, but it grew stronger with each hour that passed without finding Samuel's body. "I'm still going after him," William said finally, "but I'll try to remember that whoever has my boy, they've kept him alive for 2 days when the desert might have killed him." It was a small concession, but Eleanor could see it cost her husband dearly. She kissed his cheek gently, tasting the salt of tears he wouldn't allow himself to shed. "Bring our son home, William," she whispered, "whatever it takes." As the search party prepared to ride out, neither William nor Eleanor could have imagined the scene playing out 20 miles away, where an Apache warrior sat beside their son, teaching him how to find direction by the stars and sharing the last of his water with a boy whose trust had become more precious to him than his own safety. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when Ayanna spotted the dust cloud on the horizon. He had been leading Patches while Samuel walked beside him, the boy's small hand resting trustingly on the Apache warrior's arm. They had covered several miles since leaving their shelter, moving toward the boundary of Morrison land where rescue was more likely. "There," Ayanna said quietly, pointing toward the approaching riders. "Your father comes." Samuel squinted against the late afternoon glare, his heart leaping as he recognized the familiar figures. Even at this distance, he could make out his father's distinctive silhouette on his big bay stallion. Flanked by ranch hands, Samuel had known all his life. "Papa!" Samuel called out, his voice cracking with emotion and exhaustion. He started to run toward the riders, but Ayanna's gentle hand on his shoulder stopped him. "Wait, little brother," Ayanna said softly. "Let them come to us. Running may frighten them into doing something we will all regret." Samuel looked up at the Apache warrior with confusion. "But that's my father. He won't hurt you when he sees you helped me." Ayanna's expression was gentle but sad. "Your father sees the world differently than you do, Samuel. To him, I am Apache first, and the man who saved his son second." As the riders drew closer, Ayanna could see the moment when they spotted him. The entire group reined in their horses, and he could see rifle barrels glinting in the sunlight as weapons were drawn. William Morrison's voice carried clearly across the desert air. "Samuel, get away from him. Run to me, son." Samuel looked between his father and Ayanna, torn between obedience and loyalty to the man who had saved his life. "Ayanna helped me, Papa. He gave me water and food, and he took care of Patches." But William Morrison wasn't listening to his son's words. All he could see was his boy standing next to an Apache warrior, and 8 years of frontier prejudice and fear clouded his judgment. He spurred his horse forward, his rifle raised. "Step away from my son," William shouted. "Now!" Ayanna slowly raised his hands, palms forward, just as he had when he first approached Samuel. "I mean no harm," he called back in clear English. "The boy was lost. I found him and cared for him." "Apache lies," snarled Jake Fletcher, Morrison's foreman, his own weapon trained on Ayanna. "Probably planning to ransom the boy back to us." "No!" Samuel cried, stepping protectively in front of Ayanna. The gesture was small but profound, and it stopped William Morrison cold. His 8-year-old son was shielding an Apache warrior with his own body. "Samuel, come here," William said, his voice strained. "Come to Papa." "Not until you put the guns away," Samuel said with a stubbornness William recognized as his own. "Ayanna is my friend. He saved my life." William stared at his son, seeing something in the boy's eyes he'd never seen before, a certainty, a maturity born of shared hardship. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his rifle. "Men, stand down," William ordered. His ranch hands looked uncertain, but they obeyed. Only then did Samuel run to his father, launching himself into William's arms as the older man dismounted. William held his son tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of the boy's hair, feeling the solid reality of Samuel's small body against his chest. "I thought I'd lost you," William whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought so too," Samuel admitted. "But Ayanna found me. Papa, he shared his water with me when I was dying of thirst. He made medicine for Patch's hurt leg. He told me stories and kept me from being afraid." William looked over his son's head at the Apache warrior, who stood motionless beside the injured pony. Ayanna made no move to flee, though he could easily have melted into the desert landscape before the white men could react. Instead, he waited with the quiet dignity of a man who had nothing to hide. "Why?" William asked, the single word carrying the weight of all his confusion and grudging gratitude. "Because he needed help," Ayanna replied simply, "and because it was the right thing to do." The two men stared at each other across a gulf of cultural misunderstanding and historical conflict. William Morrison, successful rancher and pillar of the territorial community, found himself face to face with everything he'd been taught to fear and hate. But his son's life hung in the balance of this moment, and even William's prejudices couldn't blind him to the obvious truth. "The boy says you saved his life," William said finally. "The boy saved his own life by being brave and strong," Ayanna replied. "I only helped him find his way home." Jake Fletcher shifted restlessly in his saddle. "Boss, we can't just let him go. Apache off the reservation. That's against federal law." "This Apache," William said slowly, never taking his eyes off Ayanna, "just returned my son to me alive and unharmed. That trumps federal law in my book." Samuel looked up at his father with shining eyes. "Does that mean Ayanna can come to the ranch? I promised I'd show him my collection of arrowheads." The request hung in the air like a challenge. William Morrison had built his reputation partly on his opposition to Apache presence in the territory. His neighbors, his business associates, even the territorial government expected him to maintain that stance. But looking into his son's trusting face, feeling the solid weight of the boy he'd thought lost forever, William found his old certainties crumbling. "We'll see, son," William said quietly. "We'll see." As the group prepared for the journey back to the ranch, with Samuel riding double with his father and Ayanna leading the injured Patches, none of them could have predicted how this desert encounter would reshape all their lives. The seeds of an unlikely friendship had been planted in the harsh Arizona soil, watered by a child's trust and a warrior's honor. The real test would come when they reached the Morrison Ranch, where the collision between two worlds would force everyone involved to examine what they truly believed about courage, loyalty, and the meaning of family.